Welcome back. Before we get into part 2, I think it might be good to have a recap of some of the important concepts from part 1. Robert discussed how cybernetics influenced hyperstition. Cybernetics concerns itself with the study of control, as well as feedback, or adaptational learning through doing. Feedback can be positive or negative. Negative feedback is a product of control, in that it is making sure that something is contained, as opposed to positive feedback that allows for something to spiral out of control. Hyperstition attempts to make use of positive feedback to break the barriers of the control system. In the language of Burroughs, this control system is time, or the one God universe that was discussed in part 1. The control system wants us to operate, as it were, in a linear concept with concepts such as duality that are included. Hyperstition is an idea, but also an action of affecting change from the inside out, in particular by changing how we think about what is, quote-unquote, real. The rights or elements of hyperstition that Robert mentioned are 1. An element of effective culture that makes itself real. 2. A fictional quantity functional as a time-traveling device. In the Lemurian Time War story, these 2 points would be the roughly 200-year-old book that Burroughs finds that he hasn't yet written. The third is coincidence intensifiers, also known as synchronicities or meaningful coincidences. And the fourth is a call to the old ones. Because remember, this is a concept that is occult in nature. And in the Lemurian Time War story, this would be the Cthulhu/Lovecraft connection. But I believe it can also be a chaotic power such as you'll hear about in the example of Pepe the Frog and Kek, the Egyptian god of chaos. We also discussed the difference between virtual reality, or what's real in that it's an idea, and actual reality. This is dictated, though, by the control system in accordance with physics, materiality, and causality. We go more into this in part 2 with the discussion of re-enchantment and dis-enchantment that parallels to an extent with the virtual and the actual, respectively. Robert and I also discussed in this second part how feedback loops work with the help of the film The Sixth Sense. And just as a little side note here, as it doesn't take away from the main points, but Robert and I mistakenly refer to Bruce Willis's character as a policeman. He's a child psychologist in the film. We also discuss how the Pepe the Frog meme was used by chaos magicians and others to attempt to influence the 2016 U.S. election. We discuss the rhizomatic structure in more detail. Robert brings up the topic of Bob Lazar, to my pleasant surprise. So all those old Art Bell and Coast to Coast fans will get a treat. And Robert also talks about conspiracy theories in relation to hyperstition. And there's just much, much more. So let's get into it. All right, so it's becoming more and more clear, I think. Let's focus now some more on the concept of linear time and hyperstitional feedback loops, because we've touched on it but haven't really gotten into specifics yet. You brought up something very interesting in our previous conversation privately, that the 1999 film The Sixth Sense from director M. Night Shyamalan can be used to illustrate the concept of linear time and feedback loops. Now, I don't think that we have to worry about spoilers here because this film is quite old. So let's talk about how feedback loops work in this film. And I'm pretty sure everybody knows the general story, but if you can, for the sake of the listener who may not know, kind of just give a little synopsis of what happens in the film.
A disclaimer, I don't think that film really exemplifies hyperstition at play, but it's a good way to engage backwards causality.
Yes. So
But I think that's
specifically the feedback loop, that we can understand what that is about. Because sometimes I think that terms like that might be a little abstract, but if we can have a concrete example of how that is actually playing out, and this seems to be quite evident in this story.
The plot is essentially there's a kid who sees dead people and a cop. And the narrative plays out, and then at the end, we learn that the cop is dead. And so the kid is interacting with the entire time because the police officer trying to understand the scenario is himself dead.
But he doesn't know that.
But he doesn't know this, yeah. Mm-hmm. So at the moment of realization in the film where Bruce Willis, right?
Yes.
Realizes that he's dead, this revelation at the end of the narrative goes backwards and throughout the entire kind of film narrative and recodes things. It reveals them as something else. And so where we once had an officer working with a kid in a very straightforward sense, we now get a ghost working with a kid. And so Bruce Willis is kind of infected by this idea, and he learns of his own death retrochronically. Because he's been dead the entire time, but he wasn't dead the entire time until he learned he was dead the entire time.
And things that happen in the story as you're viewing it and as Bruce Willis's character is experiencing it, as you go from point A to point B, they gain a new meaning. Because there might be things that were odd, strange, why did that person say that? What was that occurrence all about? What did that mean? When you know what is actually happening, that Bruce Willis is dead, then you go back to the beginning and you look at everything through different eyes, as it were. So everything takes on a different meaning in that sense. So that's why I thought it was interesting about the feedback loop, because you're getting a different story when you go back. After you've watched it the first time, you go back, oh, wait a minute, he's dead. That's why that kid kept saying, I see dead people. So, it's like he gives it away, but we just don't see it at that point.
Exactly. Yeah, meaning is produced after the fact,
yes,
before the fact. The example I gave in my master's thesis to explain backwards causality is gravity. And I think the way people react to this when I try to explain it kind of gets the point home for me.
Okay.
Up until gravity was formally discovered and articulated, gravity literally did not exist. And when someone says to you, gravity didn't exist before Newton, you're like, what? That's impossible. It absolutely existed. And that demonstrates just how thoroughly the idea of gravity has infected temporal materiality. Like, we literally can't think of reality without the concept of gravity. It's always been there. It's always going to be there. It's a fundamental part of our understanding. And that's a system of control. Even though no one thought about it as gravity, or even acknowledged gravity before it was discovered. There was no word.
Right. It was just a given. That just happened. You don't float around in the air. You don't fly. You're stuck to the ground. And if you throw something, it falls to the ground.
It was a given.
It was just something that it just was that way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it confuses things. But just the absurdity of thinking of reality without gravity, I think kind of hits the point home of how hyperstitions can take such hold of this relationship between fact and fiction. in the same way that it plays out in The Sixth Sense. Like the revelation that Bruce Willis has, I like to kind of hyphenate that word kind of in a Fortean sense as a revaluation. And so that's this kind of retrocausal recodification of meaning networks of semiotic space.
Let's move on now and talk about how magic is involved in hyperstition. We did mention it briefly, and now we can take our little pin out of the word chaos and come back to it. You discuss a very interesting event that involved the Pepe the Frog meme and the 2016 U.S. election. And I think everybody probably will know what it is that you're talking about, but they might not know the story behind the story. So will you explain what happened here for the listeners?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll note that my exposure to this comes from a great paper by Egil Asprem, just kind of acknowledging the great work that he did without ever acknowledging the term hyperstition. And so that was my contribution to this.
Right.
I read his work and I was like, wow, this is hyperstition. And it goes a little further than that, and we'll get into that.
Okay.
But so the Pepe the Frog thing takes place on the message board 4chan and 8chan, which is kind of a random message board system on the internet. Kind of a gross place, but
it's really known for trolling. People like to go there and argue and insult and belittle each other, it seems like. I mean, I've heard that there are places where there is actual discussion that happens there and, things, but it kind of has a reputation of being just a whole bunch of trolls.
Yeah. So I think that's the nicest way to put it.
Yeah.
So leading up to the 2016 election, Egil notes that there were a lot of older Thelmites present on these message boards, kind of dropping seeds of occult praxis here and there, kind of teaching people how to make sigils, do various small occult exercises.
Mm-hmm.
And just a lot of people are interested in the occult in this space in the first place. So there's already a lot of a cultural feedback at play. But so when the Pepe the Frog thing, to go back to the term I use, semiotic territories, as an example of fictions. And memes, again, we get back to memes.
Mm-hmm.
So the meme of Pepe the Frog, which is just like this sad-looking frog, kind of generic, it gets... the semiotic territory is deterritorialized, which means its meaning is kind of thrown into upheaval.
Mm-hmm.
And as it's re-territorialized, the people on 4chan pump a bunch of anti-Semitic, racist, xenophobic, white nationalistic meaning, semiosis into the re-territorialization of this meme.
So it becomes reappropriated as something else.
Yeah, reappropriated would be like a much easier way to explain the 12 nouns I just used. So they reappropriate it as this quasi-fascistic thing.
Okay.
And from that, they use that new meaning to spread these ideas mimetically throughout various contexts. So that's kind of point one in this narrative. From that, there's this entire debacle with LOL being translated into KEK, kek, which I guess would just be like a weird laughter sound. It was just kind of this ironic thing that they did. But it ended up that Kek was the name of a chaos god in Egypt. And it was a frog.
Mm-hmm.
So you get this combination of this alt-right infected meme with Keck, and then you get this synchronicity already between like this chaos entity traveling through time to do the alt-right's disgusting biddings. And so once the election starts up, 4chan has this meme with its new meaning network and its kind of hyperstitional synchronicity as a tool to be utilized. And so the way 4chan works is when you make a post, every post gets a post number. And at this point, there are thousands and thousands and thousands of posts. So it's a long string of numbers for every post. And numbers that have repetition in their sequencing are kind of thought to have more value than other numbers. So if you like write a post and it ends with 77, that's like doubles, and it's more significant than a post that just ends in 1, 2. And so it's kind of like that's a numerological system that's going to come into play. And so through the election season, this Pepe meme was combined with posts in relation to the election. And there were a handful of posts that in that combination got significant numerical signification that was meaningful before the fact. So like the big explanation or the big example is someone posted Trump will win with a Pepe and it got like all 7s, which you only get one of those every once in a while. That's very, very, very significant. So that was meaningful for these people, and it set the foundation for this kind of rupture of meaning going forward. So I kind of glossed over the Pepe meme in that it was imbued with its own specific charged meaning.
Oh, okay.
And then propagated through its use. That's a sigil. That's how sigil magic works. I don't think I said that. And that goes back to chaos magic and also Osman Spinner's like formation of chaos magic. A sigil is just charged intent as a semiotic form.
Right. So it usually takes the form of a symbol.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which in this case is this frog. And then you get the synchronicities with chaos, blah, blah, blah.
Okay.
So in addition to like affirming things for Trump, this was also launched against Hillary Clinton. I believe when she got sick, she got pneumonia, I believe. That ended up being linked to a post with significant numbers, also including Pepe the Frog. And I think she might have fallen or something.
Yes, she did.
Yeah, that was also linked into this. Okay. So all of these events were traced forward and backward in this kind of chaos network.
Right. And this group, if I understand correctly, they kind of took credit for all of this.
Yeah. And you could dispute this and say, oh, it's just a coincidence. But we're already in the woods of coincidence intensification. Like, that's the point. A lot of magic also comes down to that. Like, it's always after the fact, but that's only a problem if you're thinking about it as a straight line.
Correct. And that's where the hyperstition comes in, because you're going back through the feedback loops, going back, moving forward and backwards. Yes. Okay.
Yeah. So when I read this paper on a mechanistic, kind of abstract ontological level, I thought, oh, this hyperstition is a good way to explain kind of this system at play. But there's an additional element that links it to the CCRU specifically, which further entrenches the hyperstition. So throughout the CCRU, they talk about feedback loops. And a positive feedback loop is kind of the contained loop breaking and transitioning into something else or falling apart completely. It's called positive feedback. And what the CCRU wanted to do with Hyperstition is create and sustain positive feedback as an effective affective process. And so one of the ways this was articulated was called accelerationism, which is also a very dynamic term that I engage in one of my papers in my master's thesis. But accelerationism is kind of a socio-political engagement of hyperstition and feedback. On one hand, you have right accelerationism, which is based on accelerating the broken political processes in the United States to such an extent that they fall apart and we have to fix them. And the people on 4chan weren't necessarily Trump supporters. They were chaos supporters. And Trump from the get-go was identified as an accelerationist president because of his just ineptitude and not knowing what he was doing. He was going to break things. People saw this from the very start. And so they wanted to get him elected to accelerate this process of social collapse. And so when you plug that into the former kind of narrative with meme magic and chaos, like you start to get a bigger picture, and the CCRU becomes more important in this narrative.
So you mentioned before that that this was a type of virus.
Yeah.
So with this example of the meme, is this like something that like lodges itself in our brains when we see this, and it like stays with us even if we're not really understanding what it means? And the more that we see it and the more that we hear about it, then it starts to take on a particular meaning and changes the way we look at things, the way we think about things, even if it's indirect. Is that how we can think of it as a virus?
Yeah, I think that's a great way to explain the linear virality of a hyperstition, like everything you just said, because it's there unconsciously or just kind of in the background. Since it's there, it's going to create coincidences that are going to literally change how you think about events that have happened. Like if I go outside and I see like a dead rat, that just might be, a dead rat. But if I draw some tarot cards before I go outside and I get like the death card, and that particular deck has a dead rat on the death card, and then I go outside and I see a death card or I see a dead rat, like that's a very significant coincidence, as opposed to there is no coincidence, it's just a dead rat. So it's kind of this meaning network through time.
So but it's also passive. You were talking about an active working by the chaos practitioners, and for political ends, that they want collapse of society, and they think that they found tools, as it were, that they can use to accelerate that collapse. So that's an active, at least in my mind, that's how I see an active implementation of this. But there's also this passive, and I think of that in a viral sense, that you can't see a virus. You don't know if you're infected with a virus until it happens, until you get sick. And you can also have a virus and it not do anything with you. Exactly. But it's still there. So there's this passivity as well. It's like it's for all seasons. It doesn't matter. You can use it. You don't have to use it. It's just there. But it's still working unconsciously, I guess you could say.
That's why I think, it's both. And that's why I think this is such a great concept to have under your belt to study magic or occultism, a culture, but also to do it and collapse the two if you want.
So that it can do both.
You could do both if you want. That was the approach I took with my master's thesis. But just like using Hyperstition to think through these passive networks of coincidence multiplication, like you can't do that with proper historical analysis, because the way we're supposed to do history is very much linear causal flow.
Mm-hmm.
And like meaning and intention in that causal linearity, like that's where historians are trying to work around and within things. And like that's kind of progressive historicism. But when you take this hyperstitional approach, you can easily connect Lovecraft to the Mothman, to Crowley, like ancient aliens, because it's rhizomatic rather than arborescent.
Right. And that example that you gave was really excellent in showing how one thing leads to the other thing and connects to the other thing and connects to the other. And you can just keep adding on and on and on. The more examples that you can think of. I mean, the whole, what was it? The King in Yellow. That was used in the first season of True Detective, the story. There's another popular culture connection for the King in Yellow and Carcosa, that there was this occult, underlying occult theme going on through that story. I don't know if you know that show. Have you ever watched that detective show?
No.
Very interesting combination of detective work and this, occult dimension that these crimes are being committed. And then all these clues keep coming up and it keeps referring back to this King in Yellow. Well, what's that about? And yeah, it's very, very interesting. And nowadays, these are and I think that's for us now, and this maybe links back to the whole cybernetic things, because we're going into this virtual world where even though it's not physical and we can't touch, there are a lot of things there, concepts in this virtual world. There's like this repository for everybody, because you watch True Detective, you hear about the King in Yellow, you're like, what's that? Google. And then you start reading about the King in Yellow. And then you start, and you're connected with all of these other ideas. And then it becomes another layer of significance. And the things that you learn are then influencing how you watch the show. And that's the feedback, correct? I think I'm starting to get the hang of this. Okay.
And so you bring up virtual reality. And so earlier I brought up the difference between virtual reality and actual reality.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is going to be a really basic reduction of kind of like Deleuze and Bergsonian time dynamics. But the virtual is real in that we have it as an idea. Right. And then the actual is dictated by the control system. So actual things for us have to be in accordance with physics and materiality, and causality. But when you put hyperstition in this, you start to get feedback between the two that kind of breaks the dynamic by following each of the rules. So when you look at it like a virtual thing, if you plug that virtual thing into a past actual thing, you can create feedback causally as an actuality such that virtual thing is now a real thing. And I think Western esotericism is doing this. Rejected religion is doing this. Because we're finding these abstract ideas that aren't really given any credence in contemporary culture, maybe as an effect of historical control mechanisms, after World War II, but the fact that we've identified like parapsychology and given more depth to Crowley and investigated Burroughs as a magician and a scholar rather than just an experimental literary postmodernist, like we're creating actual traction for these virtual ideas that are just kind of hokey up until the last 40 years or so.
That's interesting the way you explained that. Okay. let's move on to your favorite, academics.
Yeah, lots of fun.
So academically, your contribution to the discussion of hyperstition within the study of Western esotericism is known as hyperoccultation, and that's all one word. Can you explain what you mean by this term and how it works? And maybe using some of the examples that we've already been discussing so that we can deepen our discussion?
Absolutely. So what I just kind of said demonstrates hyperoccultation a little bit with this actual virtual feedback. The term hyperoccultation, I get it from the Australian scholar Amy Ireland, who's kind of a CCRU anti-expert. Absolutely brilliant writer, artist. Like, check out her work 100%. But I get the term from her. And I take it to mean this infection of the outside from within. And so this alludes back to the overlap and coincidence between fiction and fact. So I take this hyperoccultation term and I compare it to dis-enchantment and re-enchantment. First step. So when we think of disenchantment and re-enchantment, we have this general idea that the world we live in right now doesn't have space for magical, esoteric, mystical, occult events because we've been explaining things with science, specifically this linear causal Newtonian Einsteinian science. So if we're going to re-enchant reality in a forward sense, we have to allow for these things to come back in as we progress forward. So we have to find space for them or build space for them. It's very much like a reactionary movement that focuses on straightforward kind of dialectical engagement. And with my idea of, or not my idea, but my use of hyperoccultation culturally and academically, the argument would be that all of these things are already here, regardless of if they're there yet. Which might be a little paradoxical, but using hyperstition, like, we can link things, as we've said, non-linearly, backwards, forwards, sideways, to create these connections. So the outside would be things outside of the semiotic field of real. And we would link these outside fictions into existing facts that allow for them to exist at the same time. So a kind of a kooky UFO example, Bob Lazar was a engineer, educated physicist person who in the late 80s came out and said, I've been working on UFO research in Area 51 in Nevada. We're doing anti-gravity.
Yeah. I'm so surprised that we're talking about Bob Lazar right now. I'm just, okay. All right. This is cool. I know about Bob Lazar. So
Perfect.
I understand what you're talking about. Yes, he allegedly studied.
Yeah, so allegedly. That's the term here. But so when he comes out, he talks about this element, I believe it's called unobtainium. Sounds like a fictional. I don't think it's unobtainium. But he discusses this element that hasn't been discovered yet with a very, very specific molecular compound. And he says this is what allows us to do like anti-gravity stuff. And that's what I've been working on in this UFO research. And there's no such element at the time. So people say that's ridiculous. Prove it. But in the late 2000s, a research team discovers this exact element working exactly how Bob Lazar said it was going to 20, 30 years before the fact. And so there's this disparity between this fact and this fiction, and then an overlap in the past of the fact and the fiction. And if you use the term allegedly, it doesn't do anything to the narrative or give it any credence. But if you use hyperstition, you can get around that allegedly to think in the space itself without confirming it or denying it, because you're not talking about the truth, you're talking about the excess of possibility, the excess of reality. So what would it mean such that Bob Lazar was right? Because Bob Lazar was right. But does that mean what he said was true? Beside the fact. If we talk about this overlap and intensification of coincidence, we have this entire new space of speculative analysis to investigate without having to put all your chips in one basket or commit to ontological things or make yourself look like a kind of ridiculous fringe academic, because you have a methodology, a way of thinking that allows for possibility without breaking anything. That's kind of one application of this as an academic. Like, it's a functional methodology to allow for the emergence of the new within the structured.
So this might line up with the methodological agnosticism that the Amsterdam School likes to take. Just look at it for what it is. Don't judge it. Don't try to, well, I mean, maybe in your opinion, they might try to quantify it, classify it, and explain it in certain terms. But at least when I was studying, I tried to use that in my own research and really be true to that agnosticism, to say, I don't know. I'm not going to say this is true or not true. I'm just going to look at it and I'm going to see what I learn from it. So it kind of sounds like that's what you're talking about.
I think, and I spent a lot of time trying to figure this out while I was in the program. And I think it does have a lot of similarity with methodological agnosticism. I just think it's working under different parameters. So to bring the philosophical postmodernism with like rhizomes and fluidity and multiplication into the picture, I think that's how Hyperstition is doing this. Whereas it still seems like methodological agnosticism is functioning in the kind of an arborescent schema. Like, it's not a straight line, but it's still a rectangular box. And I think there's like, they work very well together. And you can have one and the other, but then on the other hand, you can't have the other with the one, if that makes sense.
It makes sense.
It's that inclusion, exclusion. Like, it's the same thing as Fort. It's the same thing as this one God universe.
Right. And I just now realized that maybe the listeners don't know what in the world I'm talking about with methodological agnosticism. So just to explain it very, very briefly, it's a position that you take as a researcher, and you're trying to remain as neutral as you possibly can. And you're not trying to make any type of judgment, claims, or trying to put something in an area before thoroughly researching the subject matter and thoroughly learning what it has to present to you. So not jumping to any hasty conclusions about a topic or whatever it is that you're looking at. Whereas, and that might sound like just, well, of course you wouldn't, but that doesn't happen a lot. Unfortunately, a lot of people do like to jump to conclusions, or they like to work from a top-down approach where they think, oh, I know everything I need to know, and then I'm going to try to work backwards, and I'm going to cherry pick things about, how it will fit my theory or my hypothesis. And we try to work from the bottom up, at least. That's our goal, that we examine, we investigate, and then whatever data we get, then we look at that, and then we try to understand it. So it's kind of that, the top versus bottom type of approach. Anyway, I didn't really mean to get off on a tangent like that, but to come back to what you were talking about, Bob Lazar, I mean, he would fit perfectly into Fort's system. And Bob Lazar, probably the people that listen to this podcast probably already know who Bob Lazar is. And he is a very controversial figure. There are people who say, no, he's just a hoaxer, he's a scammer, he's a liar. And then you have other people who say, no, he everything that he says, that's how it happened. That's what happened to him. And he's not telling any tall tales. So you're left with this in-between space of, how do you interpret this data? How do you interpret this story? And what you're saying, if I can try to mirror it back to you, is that the whole point of Hyperstition isn't to try to make any type of little category or box that you're going to stick it in. It's to let it be what it is and go from there. Just let it expand, let it unfold, let it progress from its natural state, as it were, to try not to place authority on top of it. I guess.
Nothing is true. Everything is permitted.
Right.
I'm glad we got into kind of the academic methodology, because as abstract as academia can be, a lot of the methodologies at play demonstrate how we're taught to think about reality, or
That's
how we're
true.
told reality works. So this top-down, bottom-up, forward-backward kind of model that gets utilized structures our entire way of thinking exactly as such. It's the one God universe. You're given the parameters in which you're allowed to be given. Whereas Hyperstition, like you said with Fort and the philosophy of the hyphen, it's an investigation from and as in between. And when you open in-betweenness up in a space, the entire conception of space just kind of gets recalculated. You can't think of it in the same way, so you have to approach everything in a completely new, expansive unhorizon. Then you're going to make up new words. Who doesn't want that?
Right. Okay, so I have a question that just popped into my head. What does this mean for the people who want to say, but there has to be something real? There has to be something true. Because it brings in a lot of uncertainty, a lot of doubt for I would think for many people. It's very uncomfortable to think, wait a minute, I thought reality was this way.
And I think that brings up how we think about realness and truth in the first place. Like, everything we've said isn't getting rid of truth, and it isn't getting rid of what's real. It's just changing the terms and reorganizing the field, the territory upon which those ideas play out and how they play out. And I think this, it is very uncomfortable, but it's something that's very important as culture to engage. And this gets into less Western esotericism and more critical social theory, like post-colonialism, critical race theory. If you think you know what truth is and you know what real is, that means that everyone else who doesn't agree with you, be they from a different culture, a different background, a different race, different economic status, you're saying they're wrong. Singular truth necessitates a binary of fiction, of wrongness. And that necessitates this kind of imperialistic, authoritarian colonialism of prescripted one God universe. Whereas if you open up space in which you can have a multiplicity of truth, it then just becomes a matter of communicating truths and understandings to build up reality together rather than colonialize in an authoritative sense.
So that is the goal then of this performance of Hyperstition, to break barriers down that keep certain groups in a minority position, I guess you could say. Like you have the majority minority, like there's a power system, there's a control system, and then there are people who don't fit within that system. And it's trying to break down those control barriers in a certain way.
That's one approach to the matter. So I briefly talked about accelerationism during the meme magic section. And so there's right accelerationism, and then there's left, quote unquote, accelerationism and xenofeminism. I work kind of in a xenofeminist framework where it's exactly as you just said, deterritorializing structures of understanding to allow for more voices and communication.
So it's not just about socioeconomic groups, but it's also more subjective in nature as well, going into identity and how people think about themselves, how they want to express themselves.
It bleeds into that space, but then it does the exact same thing in that space. Because identity is itself a fiction that we constantly tell ourselves to create a cohesive narrative of me or being as me. And this is also a temporal, linear temporal thing. And when you start to subjectivize Hyperstition, you realize the time control constraints at play in your conception of self that bleed into your conception of reality and feedback between. So Hyperstition subjectively, and this avoids some of the problems of structural identity politics. Because if you tell people like, oh, there's no such thing as like identity, or your identity is a social construct, it's not real, that's just as oppressive as, well, it's not just as oppressive, but it's just as authoritarian as saying what identities can be. Saying there is no identity, there is no truth. That's the ironic postmodernism that gets critiqued in the Lemurian Time War. So with Hyperstition in this in-between, like, you can have your cake and you can eat it too. So if someone identifies very strongly as a cis person, or people who have actual culture around race and ethnicity, like, it's not anyone's place to take those things away or tell them what they can and can't have. But by putting in-betweenness in the way we think about this, it allows for a possibility of maintaining things while simultaneously changing things and allowing for progression in senses that haven't already been dictated. And this, we're like way outside of, we're not way outside of occultism now, but like, this is what I'm working on right now. Kind of the socio-political, still aesthetic, ontological elements of kind of this way of thinking or way of rethinking.
Right, because this is still performance based, correct? That there's an expression of something happening. It's an active thing. It's not a passive thing.
Well, it's both. As we said earlier, like, it's active at one level as a thing you're doing, but it's still passive as something that's being done to you. Occupying the space around and in between and through would be very different than still existing in a binary mode where they're differentiated. Like, they're very much different things, but they're almost indistinguishable as such. And if you think of it that way, you can navigate it in a completely different way that you wouldn't if you just kind of take it for granted.
You just briefly mentioned xenofeminism. Feminism, yes. Can you talk a little bit more about that, what that is?
Yeah, so I mentioned Amy Ireland earlier. Xenofeminism And before I mentioned Amy Ireland, I talked about accelerationism in relation to the CCRU and Nick Land. So Nick Land, after the CCRU, maybe 10 years ago, releases this series of essays called The Dark Enlightenment, which is very much a critique of capitalism, of structural social justice, and kind of like authoritative liberal neoliberalism. And he critiques it very well as a problem that is doing more harm than good. But his solution to this is the positive feedback accelerationism that advocated for Trump to break everything so we can start over. And while that is a solution to the problem, that solution pretty much hurts everyone except for those who are in privileged positions to varying degrees. We're literally watching that play out in real time right now.
Yes.
The accelerationists were right about Trump, and we're watching that right now. But so a group of women who really liked Nick Land's critique and were kind of in that philosophical idea space didn't agree with the solution to the problem, the application of the critique. So they formed the group Laboria Cubonics to rethink how to utilize technology, feedback, cybernetics, to allow for more emancipatory, less oppressive applications of accelerationism that engage the various intersectional, and I use that term hesitantly, elements of socio-political being.
And how does this express itself in a real-time situation? I know I'm using the wrong words, real time. I shouldn't be using those words, but how does this present itself?
Well, a good example of kind of hyperstitional feedback with xenofeminism is the Afrofuturist movement, which we could trace back to Sun Ra, very much an occult kind of figure, and further back and forward, like Drexia, who were a Detroit like techno electronic group in the 80s and 90s. Fascinating. And they have a role in the CCRU as well, theoretically. But so Afrofuturism is an approach of kind of myth making and utilizing the power of myth in historical narrative to create space, to reconfigure space, to kind of recalculate flows of history that situate Black Americans, Black culture, to allow for it to have new lines of flight would be the Deleuzian term, like new possibilities that aren't restricted to the narrative that we've been given kind of as an authority. And you also see this in Sadie Plant's book, Zeros and Ones. It's a cyber feminist approach to the history of technology and machines. And she also recodes a lot of the ways we think of technology, the history of technology, and the possibilities of technology. So it's infecting these factual narratives to allow for the possibility of things that have always been there but weren't there yet.
Is it a different way of thinking about the past? Or is it a different way of creating a narrative for the present and the future? Or is it both?
Both.
Okay.
Yeah. So a really easy way of understanding this, in American history, we're taught about the slave culture. Mm-hmm. And a really simple recodification that Afrofuturism can do is changing the term slaved to enslaved person. Like, that's such a minute adjustment that has such a drastically big impact on the entire way we think about the narrative, passively and actively. Okay. Because, as you said earlier, like, you get these ideas in your head that propagate and multiply and bleed into meaning networks. And the meaning of an enslaved person is very different than the meaning of what a slave is.
Right. Okay. It's, very interesting. I wanted to give you the opportunity to talk a little bit about what you're doing now, because I think it's also relevant to the earlier discussion that we had. This is an example of how these in-between places or this inclusive model is working, if I understand this correctly. In that sense, it seems to be a continuation of what had started out as a more of a philosophical, perhaps literary type of exercise, like thought exercises to think differently about, quote unquote, the nature of things.
I think the CCRU was an occult experiment from the get-go. And you get, when you read their work, it becomes very apparent. There's so much nuance to Lemurian Time War that I didn't do it justice. But you read it and you can tell that whoever was writing it knew what they were talking about in relation to Western esotericism.
Yeah. Okay.
And so the entire development of Hyperstition is Hyperstition itself. So already from the beginning, it was doing what it was talking about doing as something it had already done.
I see. So my assumption that it was philosophical literary, that was just the means by which Hyperstition was the occult practice was being utilized or performed.
I think it is philosophical and literary, but it's thinking between those things to acknowledge that those things have been occult operations from the very beginning. The philosophy itself, it's just this production of concepts that proliferate and multiply and infect reality. Like it's very magical. It's science and art in accordance with will.
You're totally right.
So yeah, I think when you start to think in this way, you start to realize the feedback and just the already infectedness of everything we're talking about, which closes the gaps between all of these different disciplines that aren't in conversation with each other. So me doing social research right now, like I'm doing something as occultism, but I'm also reducing the space between the things I'm doing and the occult, hyper-occultation again. It's all very like cyclical in a nonlinear way.
Right. Well, it's funny because like 20 minutes ago, I thought, I'm getting the hang of this. I'm starting to understand how this works. And now 2 minutes ago, I'm thinking, oh God, I don't know anything about this. I'm so confused. So yeah, I'm doing my feedback loops, I guess. I'm going back and forth and exploring and coming to different understandings and insights throughout this whole conversation. Oh boy. Okay. So I just want to give you the opportunity to share anything else that you feel is relevant to this discussion that we haven't touched yet.
I feel like we've touched on a lot of the big points, like the role of creativity and aesthetics and art has kind of been implicit throughout this conversation. But I think it's important to acknowledge the role that creative thought plays in everything. Academic research, whether you like it or not, is creative. Objectivity is creative. And when you throw the hyperstitional time dynamics in there, like objectivity is occult temporality. Like it's all congealed and fluid at the same time.
The ultimate paradox.
Yeah.
But that's
like
the chaos, right?
Yeah.
That's the chaos. Okay.
But it's not meaningless chaos. It's the very production of meaning.
Well, there are these myths about how everything came out of chaos, that was a creative act. Numerous myths about that, about the chaotic waters and the darkness, and then there was this creative impetus, and then something new and beautiful came out of that. So could I relate it to something like that?
It sounds like you already have.
Okay. Yes, I have. I guess I have. Okay.
Oh, I want to note, at one point I was talking and I was like, wow, this sounds like a conspiracy theory. And I think it'd be easy to reverse hyperstition into conspiracy theory, but I think it's the other way around, in that conspiracy theory comes out of hyperstitional thinking. And conspiracy theory can get dangerous when you think it's the singular truth.
That's what I was just going to say, that a conspiracy theorist thinks that they know what is really going on. They think that they have the quote unquote truth.
Yeah.
So they're closed to any plurality or inclusive concept of, well, it could be a number of different explanations.
I think conspiracy theory utilizes rhizomatic thought to create narrative consistency going forward. And so there's a hyperstitional element there. It's undeniable, unfortunately. Well, not necessarily. Some conspiracies are great. Some conspiracies end up being true, but some don't, and some cause harm. And like, that's a nuance to be discussed. But I just want to acknowledge that there is a relationship between the two. But I don't think they can be conflated as synonymous.
Okay.
And I furthermore think hyperstition is a great way to understand what's at play in conspiracy and what's at stake.
Yes, if we think about the whole concept of the Illuminati, and then how that has transitioned and morphed into a satanic cult, if you will, of, especially within the music industry, that there are especially female artists that are now enslaved to this satanic system, and they have signs that they use, like the one eye sign, and all of these nefarious things that are happening supposedly to these female artists within the music industry. It kind of starts at a certain point, and then a new thing is added, and then another thing is added, and then we have MK Ultra is added, and then we have, just like you were talking about before, about the links between Crowley and Lovecraft and Parsons and Mothman, and we could probably even put Bob Lazar in there somewhere.
Oh, 100%.
So that's this, the rhizomatic connecting of all of these different ideas or occurrences and giving them meaning. And there's a relevance and a significance to that. And it's like a plausible type of explanation. I think the challenging thing for hyperstition, or for people who are considering hyperstition, is that, kind of getting back to what I said before, it's like this threatening thing. Like, well, then everything could be real. So everything could be a possibility. Everything, so what is it? Is it and it's that tendency that we have to want to fit things into, it's either this way or that way. So it is a very challenging idea. And that's why I was really excited to talk to you about this, because this is not the way we normally think about things. Not the way I normally think about things. Maybe for you, it's
I'm thoroughly infected by it at this point, which may end up being my demise. But so far so good. But I can't unthink it.
I think you're doing okay.
Thank you.
Okay, I have one last question for you, and it's kind of a personal question. If you don't want to answer, that's fine, and I'll just edit that out. But why does this concept of hyperstition appeal to you so much?
That is a great question, and I have been dreading you asking.
Oh, no.
I listened to the last 4 episodes last night, kind of in prep, And when you asked it for Thomas and Tommy, I was like, oh, is this going to happen to me? So I've been trying to come up with a good explanation. Anything I say is going to create hyperstitional feedback.
Yay!
Which is why it's a fun question. So it's just a matter of, what truth do I want to invoke at this point? Why am I interested in hyperstition? Personally, I think I've always had a thing for time and thinking about time. It's just so weird. I've always looked around and felt like there was more going on than was perceivable. And time for me is a crux to that. And then I'm also very interested in art and religion, of course. So it's kind of the convergence of all of those things. On an academic level, as an undergrad, I started to work with art theory as a philosophical, ontological thing. And this kind of came out of Artaud and Deleuze. And when I got my hands on the CCRU, I started reading it. And it was just one of those yes moments where everything I was reading, I was just like, yes, this is what I've been looking for. This is what I'm thinking. This is what I've been thinking before I knew I was thinking it. And so the coincidences were already starting to kind of take hold. A synchronicity that it came into my life in the first place. And I think that coincidence is meaningful to be kind of redundant.
It's not redundant. No, I think that's an excellent answer. I think it's a true answer. Even if you think it's just something that you made up right now, I think knowing you to the extent that I do know you, I feel that is resonating with you. So
if it's not true now, it'll be true later.
Because of hyperstition.
Because it was always true.
It was always true. Okay. Well, thank you for sharing that here. I really appreciate that. And I also want to thank you for approaching me back. I think it was in 2018 at the mini conference. After the mini conference, I think that's where we first talked to each other. And you planted the seed of hyperstition in my mind then. And I was, perfect. Oh my God, I couldn't stop thinking about this, even though I was completely confused. I just found it so fascinating. And I am so happy that you agreed to talk today about this. And I hope that the listener will walk away with thinking, okay, I think I know what this is about. I think you did an excellent job of allowing it to unfold naturally. We kind of kept looping back. We had those feedback loops of going back. So I think we were also kind of in that hyperstitional mode while we were talking about this. So I'm very, very happy that we were able to do this, because I had this idea in my mind for a while now that I really want to talk about hyperstition. And the fact that Tommy brought it up last time, I was like, oh, this is great. This is excellent. This is my perfect opportunity that I can introduce these ideas, because I think the ideas are intriguing. I think they're important. And I think that they help us, or maybe it's better to say this encourages us to think more deeply about concepts such as time and control and authority, and also about identity and plurality and this in-between space that yeah, like you said, there is more going on than what we're just seeing with our eyes. And I don't think you're alone in that. I think there are probably more people that have that feeling that there's more going on. So I think it's a good thing to have something that challenges us, kind of shakes us up, and makes us question our perceptions of what is real, what is. So again, I really appreciate this discussion, and I really thank you for being here today with me.
Well, thank you. I had a great time, and I really appreciate the opportunity.
I hope you've enjoyed this episode with Robert Cabrales. To give a bit of follow-up information, the element that came up in the discussion about Bob Lazar is known as element 115, or moscovium. It's a synthetic chemical element that was first synthesized in 2003 by a team of Russian and American scientists at the Joint Institute for Nuclear Research in Dubna, Russia. In December 2015, it was recognized as one of 4 new elements. In the late 1980s, however, Bob Lazar provisionally called it unum pentium, as it hadn't been synthesized at that time. Should you be interested to read Robert's work for yourself, you can find them at www.academia.edu under the name Robert Elio Cabrales. But of course, I will provide a whole list of links to that, as well as most of the stuff we've discussed here in the program notes. Thanks for listening.